Hello, you are listening to the Divorce University online podcast with your hosts, Thomas and Tammy Ferreira.
Hi, I'm Tammy, and in this episode, I'm going to give you a guide to child custody evaluations. Now, if you're getting ready to go through this or this has been court ordered, you probably have lots of questions. First of all, what is a child custody evaluation? How does it work? What is the court looking for? What's the purpose of it? What are they trying to uncover? How does the process work? What can you expect? What kind of information is good to provide the evaluator? What kind of information do you need to be careful when you're presenting it? All these kinds of questions that come into play for us. And so I am going to take a deep dive and explain some of this to you. All right. So first of all, I will tell you that this goes by so many different names in every state. I couldn't possibly list all the different names this goes by. But I'm going to start with here in California, because obviously that's where I'm most familiar, because that's where I am. And in California, we have an arm of the court called Family Court Services. Now, you may have seen some of our other videos. This is a hot topic in California. It's where the decision-making is made about all the child custody issues. And it's an arm of the court that's designed to sort of carry out one of these child custody evaluations in a very mini form, let's say, because the court doesn't have, they don't spend days and weeks and hours interviewing everybody and doing all that, but they do spend anywhere from, 30 minutes to 3 hours. I've seen them spend. In some jurisdictions, it can be more. It really kind of varies a lot on the situation and what the judge is asking for. But in family court services, what they generally do is they'll spend around 45 minutes with the parents. And then if the parents can't agree on how to share the legal and physical custody of the child, this person makes a recommendation. This evaluator makes a recommendation to the court of what they think that parenting plan should be. Now, that recommendation is just that. It's a recommendation. It doesn't become a court order until the judge adopts it and says, this is now a court order. Now, some jurisdictions in California, Family Court Services makes recommendations like that. But in some counties, the evaluator will actually try to carry out a mediation between the parties. And if it doesn't succeed, they don't write a recommendation. They don't disclose anything that was discussed. They just say, okay, you got to go back to the judge and let the judge make a decision. So it's real important if you're in California to understand whether you're in a recommending or non-recommending county. Now, in the non-recommending counties, a lot of times they, once they have this mediation, if they can't reach agreement, sometimes the judge will go ahead and order some form of a custody eval or a mini one. And again, this can take on a lot of different names. I've seen them called BFAs, which is a brief focused assessment. I've seen them called BFIs, which is a brief focused investigation. I've seen them called CFIs in Colorado. It's a child forensic investigation. And so there's just all these different acronyms that are used to kind of describe varying degrees of the same thing. So again, real important to research those terms and understand, because the volume of information that you're going to be able to provide is dependent on what type of assessment that you're going through. If you're going through a brief assessment, well, you're not going to be able to give a whole lifetime, right, essentially, of information for your family and your children. And so you're going to have to be much more selective. And usually in a brief assessment, they're focused on a very specific issue. So you need to understand what the court's concern is so that you can provide the information to the evaluator to, for them to be able to address that specific issue. Now, again, other states have other names for it. In California, when they do order one of those brief focused assessments or something like that for a county where there isn't a recommending person, then what happens is you go outside and you hire a private person, right? So generally when we're talking about custody evals, we're going outside and hiring a private individual that's going to conduct this for the parties. So it's it's unique that California has a version of that in some counties that you actually, go through the court and do family court services and don't pay out of pocket for this independent evaluator, which is really the more common way of doing these custody evals. So when do we see custody evals? We see custody evals typically when there are what we call red flag issues, okay? Where either there is some sort of alcohol problem, there's some abuse problem, there's some drug problem, there is severe mental illness, or a lot of times in situations where the conflict is just so bad between the parents and the courts have tried everything and can't seem to solve the problem or get to the bottom of what's actually happening. And so they don't have usually the time and the resources to dig into it at that level. And so they'll send you outside to pay someone to have this level of in-depth examination into your family so that they can figure out what's going on and they can figure out if they have a tool to solve it. Okay. So the first obvious thing is these are expensive. A brief one may only cost, less than $5,000, let's say. When you get into full-blown custody evals, I have seen those cost 5, 10, 15, 20. And then if you get to a point where, you want to put the expert on the stand and your attorney and their attorney are going to do all this cross-examination of the expert and all these different things, that really can just run into thousands and thousands of dollars. So it's very, very expensive. And most of the time we see custody evals in situations where the families have the resources to dig into it at that level. And so that's not always the case. Sometimes the court will order it and order the parties to figure out how to pay for it if they feel like the situation is severe enough. But make no mistake, this is very, very expensive most of the time in the vast majority of situations. So let's say you do have one of these red flag issues in your situation, okay? The first thing that people want to know from me is, what can I expect? And then the second thing they want to know is, how do I deal with these red flag issues? How do I bring this up in a way that somebody's going to actually listen to me? Because a lot of times when we get to the point where we're doing a custody eval or something like that, we've tried a lot of different things and it just doesn't seem to be working, right? Nobody's listening. Nobody's actually getting the gist of what's happening in your day-to-day life of trying to deal with the co-parenting issues. And so, hopefully this person who's going to dig into really the details and the nitty-gritty of what's happening is going to be able to really figure out, what's going on in your family unit. So let's talk about what to expect. Now, again, I would love to just be able to tell you A, B, C, D, here's what's going to happen. These vary a lot. They vary a lot depending on how deep a dive the court wants the person to do and what the issue is that they're worried about. So I can't give you the whole background in this one short podcast episode. I've done a lot of coaching on these, and many of my VIP clients have custody evals, are going through custody evals, or have had custody evals. This is something that I frequently coach on. And so it is good to get some help from somebody outside yourself who can just help you think through things, help you bounce ideas, help you kind of navigate the process and figure out, how you want to present the concerns that you do have. So let's start with what to expect. Okay. The first thing I'm going to tell you is expect a lot of paper. And I know that tends to be the case across the board with the court. Attorneys love paper. I don't know what to tell you about it. It took me a long time to get Thomas to go paperless in our practice. And once I did, he loved it, but he was so resistant to that idea. And these custody evals tend to happen old school like that. Some of the people have online intakes now and all those different kind of things. But whether it's electronically or on a piece of paper, you're going to be providing a lot of information is what I mean by that. I have seen it be as a brief as what are your concerns about the child? What kind of parent do you think the other parent is? Down to give me the history of how you handled discipline in your home during the child's life. Give me the history of what was your family life like? Did you take vacations? Again, the deeper the dive, the more details you're going to have to provide. And so a lot of the stuff in the beginning is sort of the background information, right? It's piecing the story together for the evaluator so they can start to learn your family, learn the family unit, and learn the dynamics within the family. So a lot of times people are hung up on issues that they don't really need to be hung up on. Whether you took vacation 4 times a year or 1 time a year doesn't make you a good parent or bad parent. It doesn't make you any more or less involved with your children. It just happens to be how your family functioned. And so that's one of the things they're trying to wrap their head around. So don't overthink this. That's one of the first things I tell people is like, if you're being honest and your goal is really to try to help your children and have the right outcome for them, try to not overthink this and overanalyze this. You have to remember that these people are experts. They do this all day, every day. They've seen so much stuff and they're so intuitive most of the time. And I'm not saying you can't get bad evaluators. We have good and bad everything in every walk of life, right? And so some people are better at it than others, obviously. And if you're going through this, you want to, look at recommendations, talk to other people, all that kind of thing before you decide on a person. But there are good and bad evaluators, but for the most part, these people have done this all day, every day. And you don't just get to a custody evaluator in, the first couple years of being a therapist. These people are generally therapists or PhDs. They've been doing this a long time. They have tons of experience, and they're very, very good at picking up on the nuances of what's going on. So if you're having a really in-depth one, be prepared to give a lot of that background. The next thing that usually happens is they're going to do individual interviews with the parents. So they're going to do an interview with you. They're going to do an interview with your ex. They're probably going to ask questions like, what do you think your strengths are as a parent? What do you think you struggle with as a parent? And let me just tell you, the answer to that question is not nothing, okay? If you're saying nothing, then you are probably thinking more highly of yourself than you ought to, and that's probably going to submarine you in this parenting custody evaluation situation. And so we all have things that we struggle with. And again, I know it's kind of hard to admit we have weaknesses and we're afraid things are going to be used against us, but really just being open and honest about, your general parenting style and how you handle discipline and what you think you're good at as a parent, what you think you're not so good at as a parent. They're probably going to ask you the same thing about your spouse, your ex-spouse, or your co-parent. What do you think they're good at with parenting? What do you think that they're not good at with parenting? They're going to ask you about each of the kids, their personalities. What are they like? What do they struggle with? Do they have academic issues? Do they have emotional or mental health limitations in any way that impact the dynamic of the family? They're going to want to know how those children interact with each other. Some siblings have better, more cohesive relationships than others. And so they're going to want to understand a lot of that kind of thing. So once they get through kind of that interview with each parent and they have a lot of that background information from the parents, most of the time they will talk to the children, particularly if the children are a little bit older. And honestly, a lot of times when we see these custody evals, it does tend to be in that little bit older range of like 10 to, the teenage years. And so custody evals are not as common, I think, when we have really, really young children. And so, all the older the children get, they have their own personality and they have their own opinion on things. And we start to get a whole nother dynamic on things. So they're probably going to interview the children, particularly if they're a little bit older. Then most of the time what will happen is they'll do a joint interview with the parents so that they can directly observe the interaction between the parents, the level of conflict, the way that you guys handle that in the process. And then I've also seen them do observations of the parent and the child interacting. Now, sometimes that's coming into the home and doing a home observation in mom's world and doing a home observation in dad's world and watching how the children and the parent interact. I've seen that, especially with COVID and all the different things that have happened over the last couple of years. Sometimes they'll observe them on video. I've seen it done that way too. But generally, there's usually some point of observational assessment, but that's usually closer towards the end. And again, if you have a brief assessment, that may not even occur. I'm kind of giving you the most in-depth scenario, and a brief assessment can include some of these things, but probably not all of these things. And again, it will be sort of based on what the issue is that they're trying to get to the bottom of. So, but in a full-blown one, you will generally have some sort of observation. And then what they do is they take that and they assess the situation. Now, they will also usually ask you a lot of times in a full, like really in-depth one, they'll ask for the court pleadings. So if you have attorneys, they will generally say to the attorneys, you get an attorney submission to submit what you think is relevant. If you don't have an attorney, then you're probably going to have that option to submit things from the court documents that you think are relevant to this situation. So that's sort of the process that they go through, and then eventually you will get a report. And the thing about these evaluations is I have so many people that kind of after the fact with, family court services or a brief one or some of those mini ones that we talked about, especially, they will come back after the fact and say, this didn't go well. Look what they said about me. How do I change it? And I will just tell you that changing these after the fact is near impossible. Your attorney can put them on the stand. They can cross-examine. They can do their part to try to unravel things. But it's so much easier if you do it well in the beginning. Then you're not having to try to come back and undo damage and do cleanup work. You've actually gotten advisement in the beginning of how to handle this well and how to present the information that you feel is important for the evaluator to know. Because this works just like the family court services issue on a bigger scale. And if you've heard any of our other stuff about that, you'll know you don't attack the other parent. You don't blame everything on them. You take responsibility for whatever your pieces are in this. And then when you do have concerns, you present those concerns in terms of how does this impact the child? So if your issue is the other parent's an alcoholic, you don't present that in terms of the other parent is this lazy, no good drunk. That's just not the best way to do it. The best way to do it is I'm concerned for the child's safety because I know the parent has a history of this behavior. And so that kind of presentation is taken more credibly, it's taken more seriously, and it's much more effective than attacking the other parent for the behavior. Then it's up to the other parent whether they want to actually take responsibility for their behavior and fix the problem. Okay. But for you to get traction on it, you have to present things in terms of how this impacts the child, because that's the part that the evaluator and the court and all these different experts are worried about. They don't care if you dislike your ex. They don't care if you dislike some of your ex's behaviors. They only care if those behaviors are impacting the safety and the well-being of your child. And so that's the message that you have to get across. And the other thing you have to do is be very focused on the key issues. So if your big concern is the other parent's drinking, then, I usually tell people, don't try to bring in, they don't return the clothes after the exchange, and they give the kids haircuts I don't like, and they let them stay up past 10, and they let them eat too much sugar, and what happens is you start diluting the main concern with all this other stuff. And then your expert or your judge or whoever you're presenting to, in this case, the evaluator, their eyes start to roll back in their head because they just get so overwhelmed with all the different problems that you're presenting that you're expecting them to come up with some magic wand to solve, which unfortunately they don't have. They're a human being just like us. And so their job is to simply evaluate what's going on and then hopefully have some tools in their tool chest that they can recommend to the court to be able to start to help solve this problem. If it's found that a parent really does have a drinking problem, what's our first go-to for that? Probably AA or therapy or supervised visitation with the child until the person complies with some sort of treatment program. Those types of things are what you're going to see. And so they can't change the other parent's behavior, right? We can't make the other parent stop drinking. All we can do is try to keep the child safe as much as possible and try to get that parent to get the help they need. And ultimately, if that parent doesn't, what I find happens is they generally self-destruct, and they'll usually destroy their entire custody case all on their own if you give them enough rope. But what happens is, again, we react out of fear and we think, oh no, what if someone doesn't see what's going on? What if someone doesn't figure out that there's this problem? And then we get more forceful about it, about the fact that, oh my goodness, the other parent drinks, the other parent drinks, the other parent drinks, the other parent drinks, and then the evaluator's like, okay, this person seems a little too over the top about this issue. Like, there's different ways that you can present this that can really make you come across not credible and make it seem like you're all about controlling the behavior of the other parent or, making them change or eliminating them from the child's life or different things like that. And really, the evaluators and the judges and everybody else in your case are there to do the same thing I talked about a few episodes ago, which is solve the problem. That's what they're trying to do. Okay, we have this problem. How do we solve it? And there are only so many tools in our tool chest to do that. Okay. So you have to be prepared going in on what your key issues are and the information that you want to present, and make sure that you're presenting it well. Because once you do this, there's no do-over. There's no undoing it. And so I highly recommend that people get some help, some coaching, some input to help them succeed in this, because you're paying a lot of money for this assessment. Like I said, even if it's a brief one, it's fairly expensive. And so if you're going to go through the stress of this for your family and you're going to go through the expense of it, then you definitely need to make sure that you're doing it well. Okay. So when you're presenting your concerns about the other parent, make sure that you're keeping that focused on how it impacts the child. And, don't do this. Don't take I know best interest of the child standard is a standard that we have in practically every state. And so what happens sometimes is people start to just slap that label on everything. They say, oh, the children should only have one overnight a week with the other parent because that's what's in the best interest of the child. Okay, that's not going to get you what you want. That's just throwing around the jargon. And throwing around the jargon can be helpful in certain circumstances, but just doing that just to show that you know what you're talking about or that you believe you're thinking about the best interest of the child doesn't make it true. They want a concrete reason, like one overnight each week with the other parent is the thing that makes the most sense, because the child is 13 years old. They know the other parent's there. They can do video visits in between. They have their own life and their own schedule. The other parent lives an hour away from school, and then they have to get up early in the morning to be able to get to school. All of those reasons, all those things I just rattled off, those could be potential reasons for the child not to be with the other parent as frequently during a week, right? But just slapping on because it's in the child's best interest doesn't get you where you need to go. You need to have concrete examples of why this wouldn't work or why you think it's not working and what you think would be better. When you can come in with your own problem-solving approach to this, you're going to do much better because the evaluator is going to see, wow, this parent really cares about the child. They're really trying to problem solve. They're really trying to figure out how to make this work and how to keep the other parent involved instead of just saying, oh, no, this parent sucks. They're horrible. They need to go away and just leave us alone, which is the vibe that a lot of people give off, especially if you've had enough conflict that's led you to a child custody eval, right? So you got to be careful how you present these things. So please take my advice, get some help up front before you go into this, and so that you can have a greater chance of succeeding, because you don't just want to do this and just waste your money. You really need to make sure you're taking the right approach with this. Okay? So if you are watching us on YouTube, don't forget to hit like on this video and then subscribe so you get notified as new episodes are released each week. If you're listening to the podcast, don't forget to rate it and review us, and also subscribe so that you get new episodes each week as they are released. And thanks for joining me.
Thank you for listening to the Divorce University online podcast with your hosts, Thomas and Tammy Ferreira. For more information, visit www.divorceuniversityonline.com.